don't do that for this, do I? Okay, we'll call the Willmar City Council work session for Tuesday, September 5th to order. First thing on the agenda is public comment. Is there anybody from the public that wishes to make a comment during the work session for the Willmar City Council? Seeing and hearing none, the next we'll go to a open meeting discussion. This is an item that is coming back to us that we had requested from staff to do some training on the open meeting law. And I believe it was probably sometime towards the first part of the year that we asked for this. And so Mr. Holland has asked Robert Scott, our city attorney, to provide this training. So if you'd like to go to the podium, that would be great, Robert. And we'll go ahead and get started. At each of your work sites is also a handout that I think we'll be following as well. So, Mr. Scott.
That's right. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. This is I guess we'll call it a training that I've done once or twice for the council, somewhat regularly. I do think, though, that there's a majority of the council that hasn't heard this before. For those that have, though, my sincere apologies. With that said, the purpose of this, and you do have slides in front of you with space to fill up with notes with all the interesting information I'm going to give you. Just be aware, I'm probably not going to go through the whole thing. This is a somewhat broader presentation than I think we have time for today. I'm going to talk primarily about open meeting law compliance and ways to sort of spot issues, problem issues and situations before they arise and know what to do when they do arise. This presentation also, on occasion, will deal with data practices requirements. I might have a point or two to make with that, but for the most part, I'm going to keep my comments to the open meeting law compliance. And then similarly, the last part of the presentation touches on conflicts of interest. And again, I might just have a couple bullets for you to take away from that, but I'm not going to go through those slides in detail. So most of my presentation will be through pages 1 through 8 of your handout. So with that said, as I mentioned, the purpose of this training is to kind of cover the open meeting law. I'm sure it's not the first you've encountered it or been given any training on it. I think if you participated in the new elected official training through the league, you would have had it at that point. And so I'm not going to try and go through every requirement of the open meeting law. The main point of doing something like this is to increase your awareness of just the general purpose served by the law, which will help you spot some of the recurring violations that we see both in our office and just having researched these issues. We kind of know there's certain themes and certain situations that recur that result in violations that catch elected officials off guard. So with that, in order to recognize when these issues that tend to result in most of the violations will present themselves, it's really important to have just a basic understanding of the policy served by the open meeting law. And it's really can be boiled down to this simple statement. It's to allow the public to observe the government decision-making. So you're each elected members of this governing body. The open meeting law requires that for this body to conduct its business, the public should be able to observe that generally. That has two components. A notice requirement so that the public knows when you're going to meet, and a requirement, again, a general rule that when you do meet, that it be open to the public so anyone who wishes to observe the governing body in action will have that opportunity. So that's the basic purpose served. There's a couple things that I think a lot of people sometimes assume the open meeting law requires that it doesn't. It does not require public participation in your meetings. It doesn't really reach into the actual procedure for how you operate once you have a meeting. So it doesn't mandate that a specific parliamentary procedure be followed. It doesn't mandate that any parliamentary procedure be followed. It just mandates when there's a meeting, you give notice to the public so they can watch you conduct your business. There's three issues that come up frequently when courts are trying to determine if the open meeting law applies, and if so, if a violation has occurred. And fortunately for us, the first two are pretty straightforward. The first question is, what is a public body? Because the open meeting law by its terms applies to public bodies. There's absolutely no question that as a city council, you are a public body of the state and subject to the open meeting law. The third issue is what the bulk of this presentation is going to address, and that's the question of when is a meeting? What is a meeting? Obviously, when you're all gathered together in this room, we all understand that's a meeting of the public body of the council, both your work sessions and your regular meetings that follow. But it's surprising sometimes to know that situations that you might not at first blush think of as being a meeting can be considered legally to be a meeting. I'm skipping through just to the slide on what is a meeting. So a meeting, case law, that's not defined in statute, but case law has defined a meeting to be any time a quorum or more of the public body gathers together to discuss public business. There's several issues that can come up where you can be considered to have had a meeting outside of a formal get-together like this, where everyone understands you're in a meeting. And I'm going to talk about each one of these in some detail. And again, the purpose of this is just to help you spot when there's a potential trouble spot on the horizon, or when a situation arises that could result in some legal complications for the city, and if it was found there was intent for the individual council member to, so that when these situations do arise, as they inevitably will at some point, you're understanding that there could be open meeting law issues and you know what to do about it. So the first situation that arises frequently when council members could find themselves in something that's considered a meeting legally without thinking necessarily that that's the case would be social gatherings. As community leaders, it's not unexpected that you will on occasion be invited to social gatherings, banquets in the community where you will, at least a quorum or more of you will be together. I'm sure there are situations when the entire council gets invited to events like this. This is not necessarily a meeting, but it can fall within the definition of a meeting under our case precedent if you aren't careful and if public business is discussed. And it sounds, so the first rule of thumb, I guess, is if you do find yourself in a non-city organized event, but there's still a quorum or more of you, and for the record, a quorum would be 5 council members, as defined in charter. So anytime any discussion or gathering grows to include at least 4 of your colleagues, that's when you know you at least really need to think about whether there's an open meeting law issue. But in a social gathering, if you're seated at the same table or just crossing paths, the first rule for everyone to remember is do not discuss city business. And it sounds really easy, but I can tell you just human nature being what it is, when you see your acquaintances, everyone knows each other from council meetings, human nature would lead you to talk about things you have in common with each other, and that for many of you would be city business. So this is a situation that can become a problem if an issue that's coming up on an agenda or something that's on everyone's mind gets discussed and council members start sharing what their position is, or even worse, I think, trying to argue or lobby with your colleagues to come around to your position. Anytime information like that, and that's how governing bodies come to their positions. That's how they take action, is to deliberate. And it's not entirely clear where the line is, but it's not far-fetched to think that you can start to approach that line or even cross it if you're not careful, if you find each other at a non-city organized function. So there's a couple of things to be aware of to try and avoid that becoming an issue. The first is at a staff level. If we know that, for example, there's a social event that the whole council's been invited to and will be attending, especially if they're going to be seated together, providing a notice under the open meeting law that the meeting's going to happen and calling it a special meeting will basically protect you from anything that does happen. That's still you should still follow Rule 2, which would be don't discuss city business, but if we have notice that it's going to happen and you put a notice out, then you're at least covered. And as I mentioned, the second part of that is if you do find yourself at a non-city organized function and there's at least 4 of your colleagues there, then you know you really should be careful and try not to discuss city business. On a similar note, another time when there have been many violations of the open meeting law found in other cities would be conversations that just naturally occur before and after council meetings. It's natural to talk to your seatmate, your neighbor on the council chambers, or anyone else that arrives at the same time as you. You don't need to stop doing that, but obviously your guard should go up if your conversation with 1 or 2 members grows to the point where others start gathering and all of a sudden you've got 4 of your colleagues involved in a conversation. And the issue with that is it's, technically it's either before or after your meeting occurred, but more to the point, your mics are likely off. The purpose of the open meeting law being to allow people to observe the city council doing its business is frustrated when those conversations are taking place and the council and the public may be able to see it happening, but they can't hear. So just be careful before and after meetings and avoid situations where a quorum of you gather to talk. So the probably largest category in which open meeting law violations are found are what's called serial meetings. And this is tricky because a meeting of the council can be found to have occurred without any of the council members necessarily knowing that the discussion involved a quorum. And that means that the quorum was never together in one location or in one conversation at the same time, but conversations happened between 1 or 2 members, and then someone in that group had the discussion of the same matter with 1 or 2 other council members. And if that happens and more than a quorum are involved at any point in any one of those conversations, that can be found to be a violation of the open meeting law. So that can happen, obviously, with in-person meetings. It can happen over the phone, and it has happened. So if you are having, and it's, there will be situations where you need to communicate with other council members. Preferably, that would just be one-on-one. It can happen with groups of 2 or 3 others, and you wouldn't have a problem with the open meeting law. But you need to be careful, and I think it's incumbent on council members who have a discussion like that to inquire of the others they're communicating with if anyone else on the council has been contacted. The issue is if one council member is communicating with 1 or more council members in one conversation, perhaps trying to convince the council members to support that council member's position on an issue upcoming before the council, and then those council members confer and try and get other council members on board. That's how governing bodies conduct their business, and if that happens outside of a noticed meeting, then courts will find that to be a violation. So in-person meetings and phone conversations are one thing. The real tricky part is with email. And I assume everyone here would be like me. The vast majority of my communications are through email. There will be occasions when emails need to be sent to the full city council by staff, perhaps by the mayor regarding an upcoming meeting. It's okay to have those emails go out, but they can become violations very quickly if, for example, one council member replies to all and starts sharing that council member's position on whatever issue it is that's upcoming. Emails really should be used to, if they're going to the full council, it should be used just to share information or to coordinate schedules. If you're trying to find time for a retreat or for a special meeting or something, and the responses should be limited to, again, the scheduling issues, or really there's no need to respond if it's just simply distributing information. There are some best practices to follow. We definitely try to follow them in our office. And I think staff does that here too, but I guess renew the recommendation to staff that on those occasions when emails do need to go to the full council, and again, it's obvious that that's going to have to happen on occasion. One way to prevent an accidental violation by a member replying to the whole group would be just to BCC the full council. So if you see an email from me that I have to send to the full council, I will try and either address it to myself or to the mayor or to Ike, and just list every council member's address in the BCC field. That way, when you receive the message, if for some reason there's a response that you feel is needed and you, without thinking, as I think all of us do on occasion, click reply all and share your thoughts, you have not shared those thoughts with the full council. So that's, I think, an easy way to try and head off some of these issues that have come up on occasion. Related to email, for a long time after Facebook and similar sites came out, I think city attorneys were really troubled by their implications for elected officials who wanted to have a social media presence and maintain a blog or a Facebook account where they discuss city business, and it really was a gray area without any clear answers for a long time. The concern then again is if you're an elected council member and you're trying to marshal support through social media or through a blog post or something that all your colleagues on the council read, that's, you know, again, that's how city governments formulate policy, and if that's happening outside of a noticed meeting, is that okay? Well, fortunately, on this part, at least, the legislature has really cleared it up, and we now know, because of their recent statute, that social media postings do not violate the open meeting law so long as, and this is the important part, the account or the communication is not restricted and is open to the full public. So council members, if you have Facebook accounts, I think there are ways to manage the privacy settings where not everyone can see your message. If you have such an account or any similar social media account where you're sharing your thoughts on city business, you need to make sure that it's open to the public, that anyone can access your ideas and your posts. And as long as that's the case, we know that under statute, you have complied with the open meeting law. So all this has been under the umbrella of what is a meeting. And it's important because once we know whether something is a meeting or not, we know if the notice requirements of the open meeting law are triggered. So we talked about there's two overarching principles for the open meeting law. First being to give notice to the public so they know when the meetings occur, and the second being to allow them to observe your actual meetings. There's basically 4 different ways a meeting of the council can be noticed. The first is the most straightforward, and you do it, I think, every January, which is you adopt your meeting schedule for the year for all your regular meetings, and it's usually by resolution stating that your regular meetings will be the first and third Monday, except following a legal holiday like tonight, when it will be on Tuesday. Once you've done that, the public has notice of all of your regular meetings. So staff doesn't have to post special notices for each time you meet at your regular time. Your work sessions now, by resolution, we've included those in your regular meeting schedule. So every other week, we know that you've got a regular meeting. The public is on notice of those just from January of every year. For special meetings, which is when you meet not on your regular days, that does require special meeting notice. It requires 3 days posting. Staff's familiar with this. I'm letting you know just so you're aware of how this works. So staff handles the notice for all your special meetings. And that just requires being posted outside your regular meeting room or on the principal bulletin board 3 days in advance of the meeting. The key thing with a special meeting is whatever the purpose of the meeting was as provided in the special meeting notice is what you have to limit the discussion to at your special meeting. So if you met on a special meeting to discuss a certain project for whatever reason, and you convened and you discussed that project and you finished early, you're not able to move on to other issues that weren't included in the meeting notice. The special meetings are for the limited purposes for which they're noticed. On extremely rare occasions, there could be cause for an emergency meeting. That's if something, if there's been a disaster or for some reason there's just a really, really important reason for the council to meet without giving the 3 days posted notice. It's a council determination when those circumstances are met. And then the only requirement is that when you meet, you have to make every good faith effort to notify the press that you're doing so at least the press can be there to report on what happened. Since I've represented the city, I don't think there has been cause for an emergency meeting. We have had them come up on occasion in other cities, but it's, like I said, it is extremely rare. Related to that, I guess the only other way the council can meet and have satisfied the notice requirement is for continued meetings. So for example, if you're in a properly noticed meeting, whether it's a regular meeting or a special meeting, and for whatever reason you couldn't complete your business, you couldn't complete consideration of whatever item was pending at the end of your meeting and it was pressing and you needed to act on it quickly, you could continue the meeting to the next night or something. And as long as you announce during the properly noticed meeting the date, time, and location of the continued meeting, that continued meeting will be considered to have complied with the notice requirements of the open meeting law.
Robert, could that be held then in less than the 3 days?
It could, yes. So one other issue is, this has come up, I don't think we've done it in Willmar yet. We have helped other cities do this. If a council member is going to be absent from a meeting, some public bodies under state statute are allowed to have a member participate by telephone. City governments are not one of those entities, so we can't have council members call in to a council meeting, and similarly, you couldn't just have the whole council call into a number and conduct a meeting that way. The one thing you can do, though, is interactive television, and by that, I think every time we've helped a city do it, it's been through Skype. So if a council member, just for whatever reason, cannot attend in person, but really thinks it's important to attend that specific meeting, the council member does have the right to attend basically through Skype. It would likely be an internet connection. The requirements would be that the council member appear on a screen in this meeting room, so wherever the council member may be, you'd have to have a video connection, and it would have to be, the image would have to be displayed in this room. And the second piece of that would be wherever you happen to be, whether it's 2 counties away or 2 continents away, you actually have to post notice, and if you're in a hotel, for example, in the lobby of the hotel that you're going to be participating in this public meeting, and allow anyone who would like to come watch you participate. So if you're vacationing in London and you want to attend the meeting, you have to put a notice in the hotel lobby in London, just in case any interested Londoners or vacationing Willmarites want to watch you participate in the meeting. But it is an option. I just noted that, so.
Robert, do we have to make notice of that a council member will be attending via electronic?
Yeah, we'd have to do a special notice. So we would need advance notice. We couldn't set this up the day of or anything.
Right.
So going back again to the 2 overarching requirements of the open meeting law, 1, that notice be given, 2, that the public be allowed to observe the meetings. The second one is a general rule. There are exceptions to it. The open meeting law does recognize that sometimes there are issues that are so sensitive or for which the city's need for confidentiality is so great that the public should not be able to observe. So I've just put the exceptions to the open meeting law on the screen. The ones I'd highlight, the ones that come up most frequently, I would say, would be performance evaluations of your administrator. If you want to meet to deliberate regarding labor negotiation strategy, when you're considering buying or selling real or personal property, we just did that, I think, a month or 2 ago. And if there's a case of something that's being litigated or where litigation has been threatened and appears imminent, You are able to close a meeting to receive attorney-client privileged advice and have a privileged, candid discussion with your legal counsel. When that happens for an attorney-client privilege meeting, since the whole point is to allow you to have candid communications regarding strategy with your attorney, the requirement obviously is that the attorney attend that meeting. It can be in person or by phone, but you must be communicating with your attorney to close it under that exception. We have not had to do that, fortunately, recently at all. I think the first year or two I represented the city, there were a couple issues we did that. So that's actually a good sign. When you do have one of these situations and you are able to close a meeting, there is a specific process that has to be followed under statute. And again, you always have to notice the meeting. So even if it's going to be closed to the public, you do have to notify the public that the meeting is going to happen. The same notice requirements that would apply if the meeting were open would apply even if it's going to be closed. But once you're in the meeting, in order to close it under the open meeting law, two things have to happen. You have to identify the specific provision in statute in the open meeting law that allows the meeting to be closed, and you have to describe the subject to be discussed. So as an example, a couple months ago, when you closed the meeting to consider making an offer to purchase real property, you had to both cite the specific statute and subdivision that allowed the meeting to be closed for that purpose and identify the property you're going to talk about. Similar requirements, and this is something that our office would always work with the mayor and the city administrator on to make sure that when we know a meeting will be closed, that it's going to be done correctly. If, for whatever reason, something comes up and it is found that there was a violation of the open meeting law, I guess you need to be aware that there are some teeth to this statute. And that there's consequences both for individual council members as well as for the body as a whole. And they're summarized on this slide. It can be a personal fine of up to $300 on the individual member, and that fine can't be paid by the city. If there are repeated violations, and there are 3 separate adjudications that the open meeting law has been violated by one council member, under statute, that council member would forfeit office. I'm not aware of any recent cases where that has happened, but that is in statute. And then for the city government itself, for the council as a whole, there's much larger fines that can be imposed. You can be held responsible for the attorney's fees for anyone who brings an action challenging that the council violated the open meeting law. I would say the most damaging consequence, however, if there's a violation, isn't the fines for individuals or for the body as a whole. It's just for the lack of trust that results from that. It will almost certainly result in some bad press. It will result in increased scrutiny from the public and from the media, and it doesn't look good. And it undermines the public's confidence that the council is acting appropriately and in their best interests. So there's some institutional damage that can result if the council isn't careful and there are violations.
Question. It says intentional violation. I'm assuming like if you did a violation of a serial meeting and you did it and it was unintentional, once you've been served that you have done it, I would assume that if you do it again, then it's intentional?
Yeah, and that's an important point I should make. I'm trying to give you, this would definitely be considered more conservative advice, some rules of thumb to follow to make sure that you never even are accused of engaging in an open meeting law violation. In the event something happens and someone makes the accusation, intent is a big part of the defense I would make on your behalf and on the council's behalf. If it was an accident, there's ways to try and address that, and if not meeting the letter of the open meeting law, at least meeting its spirit. You know, for example, if there is an email chain that grew beyond what people were aware of or really were tracking, where city business was discussed, one way to try and preemptively head off any accusations would just be to publish the email string before your next meeting, so that the council sees what, or excuse me, so that the public sees what the deliberations were. So for sure, to be subject to these kinds of penalties, I think a court would have to find that the council member not only was maybe careless, but also probably could be charged with some knowledge that what they were doing was not allowed under the open meeting law. So the rest of my slides, for the most part, deal with the Data Practices Act and conflicts of interest. There's a couple points to make, I guess, without going through these slide by slide. The first is that the Data Practices Act is, if the open meeting law is a several page law, the Data Practices Act is much more extensive, much more involved. It applies to all data that comes into the possession of the city at any point in the course of operating the city government. That can be stored electronically. It can be stored, in paper documents. It can be on city systems, or it can be on, if you're not careful, personal devices of city staff or city council. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the point for now is that the open meeting law is not as comprehensive as the Data Practices Act. There occasionally may be a dichotomy between what the open meeting law requires be conducted in public and how the Data Practices Act would define a specific piece of government data. So the open meeting law does contain a provision in it that addresses that situation that says if it's necessary to conduct your business and there's not a specific exception that allows you to close a meeting, you are allowed to discuss data that the Data Practices Act defines as not public. And you can do that without penalty. The tricky part, if that does happen, is to remember that even though it was discussed in an open meeting, the Data Practices Act continues to apply after the meeting, and it would have to be, if it's not public, you'd have to continue to protect it as if it had never been publicly discussed. So that's something that's getting into the nitty-gritty a little bit, and if that situation arises, I think that's when it's up to me to alert you that something you talked about in your meeting you have to protect differently than you would anything else you discussed. So my presentation would normally go into all the requirements that apply to city records and city documents and any data that comes into your possession. There's basically 3 statutes. There's the Official Records Act that applies to your official documents, and that would be documents that document the actions, the official actions taken by the city council. That includes your meeting minutes, copies of resolutions, copies of contracts the city that enters into, and those have to be preserved indefinitely. That's something city staff is well aware of and has great systems in place to accomplish. The record retention statute basically requires that whatever data comes into city possession, you have a schedule for how you handle it. You don't have to keep everything that the city ever has indefinitely. You've got schedules, and again, that's something that's handled at a staff level. The Data Practices Act is the more extensive act that applies to all government data, as I mentioned. And 3 points I just want to make on the Data Practices Act. Complying with it, the burden of compliance falls almost entirely on city staff. They're trained in it. They do a great job. On occasion, if there's a question, they'll consult our office, and we handle data practices issues all the time. It establishes a presumption that any data in the government's possession or in the possession of any of its elected officials or city staff is public. So unless there's something in the Data Practices Act that applies to say otherwise, city data is presumed to be public. And that's important because as council members, you do receive city data. Obviously, you receive the public council packets, but on occasion, I'm sure you receive other communications and other information. it's important to try as best you can, and I think your policies actually make this a requirement, to use your city-issued email address and your city-issued devices, and to not use personal email or your personal devices. Don't, for example, save city documents that you received in your official capacity on your personal device, if at all possible. The reason for that advice is if the city does get into litigation, or even if there is no litigation, but someone has made a data request to the city for data that has gone to the council, and the council hasn't kind of kept a firewall between their city accounts and their city device and their personal, it could subject your personal device or even your private, your email accounts or devices issued by your private employers to search to determine if there's data on that device that's responsive to either the discovery request in litigation or the records request that was made to the city clerk. So that's, I guess, takeaway one under the Data Practices Act. The second one I would say is it really falls on staff and on occasion to our office. If data is going to be distributed to the council that is not classified as public, that's private or confidential, we should be letting you know that. It's up to us, I think, to help you comply with all the requirements of the Data Practices Act to keep private data private. So I know when our office has to send a privileged communication out or communicate or send documents relating to personnel data, for example, that's generally presumed to be private, we will try and make it very conspicuous in the communication that the data is private and tell you what that means. So guys, point being, watch for communications either from staff or from us that are labeled not public, private, confidential, and be sure to follow those instructions because there are teeth to the Data Practices Act as well, similar to the open meeting law. The final takeaway, I guess, under the Data Practices Act is just be especially careful if you're dealing with data that pertains to any of your city staff. I just mentioned, I think, while the vast majority of data that comes into the city is public and it's all presumed to be public under the Act, for personnel data, that's data on specific city employees, the presumption is flipped because that's very sensitive and protecting the reputations of city staff is deemed more important in that case than the general presumption that government data is open. So personnel data is presumed to be private unless something in the Data Practices Act says that is public. So that, especially if you receive information on city employees for whatever reason in connection with your duties, is one area where immediately a red flag should go up and you should think that this is sensitive information and you should be careful with. And again, though, you should also receive specific instructions and notice from our office or from city staff on how you need to handle that data. So with that, I'm going to skip ahead and I talked about personnel data. This is some other data, just to some other categories of data that is generally not public. If in the course of your duties you are sent information in any of these categories, and it's in the slide that you're welcome to take home, that's when you need to be careful, and that's when your guard, I guess, should go up about, is this something that I need to be careful with and that isn't public? And then just a couple points on conflict of interest. You have a specific policy that applies to you. I'm sure you were all issued it when you were sworn in. That policy was drafted in order to comply with all state statutes and state case law that have addressed conflicts of interest. So by following your conflict of interest policy, you will be following what state law requires. Generally, a conflict of interest is when you have a personal financial interest in something that's going to come before the council. The most frequent areas where that can arise is if you own real property that is going to be the subject of a project, for example, is going to be assessed, or if you are seeking some sort of zoning approval for your property, you all, as if you own property, would have the right to develop it as any member of the public would, but what you wouldn't have the right to do would be to influence the council's decision if there is a decision to be made by the council.
Robert,
Yes.
so does that influencing the council's decision include making comments during the meeting? So does that mean a council member needs to step away and not be a part of the discussion? Step away?
Yes.
Not necessarily physically, or?
Yes, what it means is if we've identified, and to back up a minute, if you think that there may be a agenda item coming up or some action that the council is going to be asked to take that you do have a financial interest in, I think the first call should be to your city administrator. Likely, he would then call me. Between the two of us, we'll, I think, at least give you an opinion on whether in fact there is a conflict of interest, and if so, how to handle it. It usually comes down to two principles. One is disclose the interest publicly to the council at the first reasonable opportunity to do so, and then abstain from participation in the council's decision-making. And that means not just abstaining during the vote, it means abstaining from the council's discussion. Now, council members, if we're talking about, for example, a zoning application for property owned by the council member would have the right to advocate for that application, the same as any member of the public would, but you couldn't do so in your official capacity. So what we'd recommend would be, in that case, you, after disclosing the conflict, basically come down and address the council, as I'm doing now, as a member of the public, in favor of your application, but not try and influence the council from the council table, and obviously abstaining on the vote. That applies for the vast majority of conflicts. There's one special category of conflicts where there are more onerous requirements, though, and that's if you're going to enter into a contract with the city council. And in fact, there's a general prohibition in statute against council members entering into a contract with the council. And what would an example of that be? If a council member has a professional services firm, for example, and the council is in need of those services, generally the council member is not going to be able to enter into that contract with the council. And unlike non-contractual conflicts, that contract, were it to be entered into in violation of the prohibition, would just be void. So and everyone who knowingly approved of it on the council would technically be guilty of a misdemeanor, as well as the interested official. So there's broad ramifications, and even beyond the cases where there's a financial interest in something like a zoning case or a licensing issue, if there's a situation where the city is going to be entering into a contract and you think you might have some sort of interest in that, and this means that your personal financial well-being will be somehow affected by approving the contract, that's when I think you need to call Ike in the first instance, and probably we would get involved and look at it and see if it's really an issue or if one of the exceptions applies or a lot of exceptions. So those are the two takeaways. On abstentions, the remedy is usually, as I mentioned, to abstain. That has implications for the vote required to pass something. So abstentions, just as a general rule, so everyone understands, if council members under your procedural rules, as far as I know, under state law, have the right always to cast a vote of abstain on any given matter. If they do that, generally, it's treated as a no vote. The exception to that is if the abstention is because of a disqualifying conflict of interest, so that the council member could not have voted legally, even if the council member wanted to. In that case, it's treated as if you had a vacancy on your council. So you have let's take a situation where you have 7 council members present, and make sure I get my math right. You have, let's say you have 6 council members present, you have 3 vote in favor of a motion, 2 vote against, and 1 voluntarily abstain. unless we can determine that there is a disqualifying conflict of interest that required the abstention, that's treated just like a no vote. So even though most things would pass with a majority of the quorum present at a given meeting, under that situation, even though there were 3 yes votes and 2 no votes, it would essentially be a tie because the abstention would be treated as a no vote. Reason I say that is if you are in a situation where you abstain because of a conflict of interest, it's definitely important to meet the first requirement of the city's policy, which is to disclose the reason for abstaining. And the reason, again, is because that would have implications for what the required vote is for the measure to pass.
So recently, we've had a lot of abstentions, more than we've had for quite some time. So what you're telling me, if I'm hearing this correctly, is that unless that person has talked with the city administrator or you, that vote is considered a no vote.
Yes, that's correct.
So if we had, and I'm thinking of one situation where we had 2 abstentions, and I remember how that went a couple meetings back.
If the council members abstaining.
So are you watching that? I mean, so you're watching that? So, I mean.
Yeah, we have.
Because I'm not going to know that if they've talked with you about it. You know I asked you one time before when we had an abstention, and I asked the council member why they were abstaining. They said, I don't have to disclose that. And so then in that particular vote, that would have been then counted as a no vote. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Correct, yes. And just so everyone knows, with recent abstentions, I am not aware that those were the result of a conflict of interest. If someone is required to abstain because of a conflict of interest, generally under your policy, they are also going to be required to make a disclosure of what that conflict is.
Right.
And in that case, then we would treat the abstention not as a no vote, but as if there were an absence or a vacancy on the council.
Is it appropriate when if we don't know and the person perceives it, a follow-up question of an abstention to ask if they have a conflict of interest?
It's fair game, I think, to ask the question. Under your procedural rules, I think this came up a couple of years back and I had to look into it, so I remember, I don't think there's anything that can compel a council member to disclose a reason for an abstention. But I think it's fair game and part of the political debate to ask that question. I guess to kind of put a bow on this, I know that the League of Cities, while recognizing council members may cast votes of abstain, recommends against it unless there's a conflict of interest. Just because they're going to be considered a no vote anyway, and it's easier to count them all. And if someone is uncomfortable voting for something and they don't have a conflict of interest that prohibits them from voting, I know the league recommends, and it's a recommendation, that the council member just vote no. But that's,
But we don't have to follow
Councilmember
the
Nelson.
recommendation.
like I said, that's not a legal requirement.
Correct.
Just a clarification, if I understood you correctly, if we're voting on a contract, you said that the rest, if somebody abstains and they have a conflict, that the rest of the council members can be held responsible?
Anyone.
Is that if we know there's a conflict, or do we have the right, when we're in a contractual kind of situation, to ask why they are abstaining?
Yeah, anyone who knowingly approves a contract with an interested member who has an interest in that contract under the state law prohibiting those contracts could be held guilty of a misdemeanor.
But
No.
if the person refuses to disclose
Yeah, so
why they're
that-
abstaining?
In that case, that wouldn't be a knowing act if the council is not on notice that the contract they're approving is with one of their members who has an interest in it. And I guess what I would say on that is, one of the reasons we do presentations like this is to make everyone aware of this prohibition on conflicts with interested members of the council, so that in the event a situation is going to come forward, that member or someone with knowledge of that interest would sound the alarm and talk to the city administrator. And, you know, we get conflict of interest questions frequently. This is something that comes up, especially in smaller towns. I mean, you're governing and you're affecting your own businesses, you're potentially affecting your own family and property that you own. That's unavoidable to some extent. I would say probably 4 times out of 5, the answer from our office is, no, that's not actually a conflict of interest. You know, thank you very much for recognizing the potential at least and for looking into it, but, you know, usually it's not a disqualifying conflict of interest. When it is, we'll know how to handle it. Usually it means, again, make a disclosure and abstain from participating. If it's in a contractual matter, then it becomes more complicated. I've given you the general rule. There's about 18 exceptions to it. We'd have to look at each of those and see if there's an exception that would apply. If there's an exception, there's specific procedures you have to follow, affidavits that might have to be made. So recognition of the issue before a vote takes place is the key for all of this.
Then one other question that I have. So what you had said earlier is that if you're going to abstain from the vote, you should explain why you're going to abstain, but then you also should abstain from the discussion in regards to it. Is that your recommendation as well? I thought I heard you say that, but I want to make sure that I've got that correct.
That is absolutely correct. For abstentions because of disqualifying conflicts of interest or even potential conflicts of interest, I think under the city's policy, it's required that a disclosure be made. So I would absolutely recommend that if someone is abstaining because of a personal financial interest or a potential interest, that you make that known before the vote takes place, and really at the earliest opportunity. First question being before the meeting, though, to the extent possible, you should make the city administrator aware of the potential issue.
I was just going to interject, and he just said it, but I'll repeat it again, is normally the practice has been that if you have a conflict, that when it comes up on the agenda, that is the opportune time to say, Mayor and Council, I'm going to abstain from the conversation because my brother owns that company. And then that's it. But they don't wait till the end or anything like that. But in general, that's what you do. You don't wait till the end and say, well, I abstained from a vote. You do it right up front when it comes on the agenda. Everybody sees what's on the agenda, so you do it at that time.
Okay, thank you.
So,
I think we're hitting a nerve here.
well, so basically, if somebody abstains, and it's not because of a conflict of interest, they're just taking that voice and that vote away from the people they represent? Because they're
I mean, potentially, that's one way to look at it. I know that the league's advice on this, and again, this is the league's recommendation, is that by abstaining voluntarily on a matter where there's not a conflict of interest, that it's not illegal, it's not contrary to the open meeting law, but it kind of frustrates the purposes served by the open meeting law. So we've talked about what those were and what the specific requirements are to further those purposes. There isn't a specific requirement in the open meeting law that prohibits voluntary abstentions, but the league at least is recommending that council members avoid taking voluntary abstentions for the same reasons.
So does a member of the public have the right to ask if someone abstains? Did they have a conflict of interest? I mean, I've been asked that question, and I can say I don't know why they abstained, but do they have a right to contact the city and ask for clarification as to why someone abstained?
I don't know that they have, certainly they don't have a right, during the meeting itself. Do they have a right? I suppose anyone has a right to make any requests for any information that they think they need or they're interested in. So, yeah, I think anyone would have that right. How the city would have to respond to it would depend on what documents the city has. And
They could just call the individual.
they could call the
Say, hey,
individual.
why did you abstain? I mean, I've had people call me, and to me, an abstention is, say there's money being spent on a project, the parks. that we just have been dealing with. And you're not against parks, but you don't think you can't vote for it because we have obligations elsewhere we should be spending the money. An abstention to me is just not a yes vote, which you could call it a no vote, but I'm just saying it's not a yes vote. How about passing? Then you can say, well, I pass.
Whatever we call it. I mean, we're getting well
getting too
beyond
deep.
the open meeting law at this point. I've told you what the league's recommendation is. I will just say legally, in that situation, it counts as a no vote. I mean, it will be recorded as an abstention, but if you're trying to figure out, did the measure receive enough votes to pass, the abstention, or excuse me, the abstention will be counted as a no.
So I can think back on one situation where the council voted, we had 2 council members abstain, and we only had 6 council members here, and we needed that additional vote. I think it was Councilmember Meskey's first meeting,
For a city administrator?
for a city administrator, and I mean, that really affected the outcome of what happened. I mean, we ended up going and having to re-vote. You'll remember we had to go back and re-vote.
Yeah, I remember there was a motion to reconsider.
Motion to reconsider, that passed, and then,
Yep, I remember that, yes.
so I mean, there are times when that, I guess what I'm saying is, I'm going to try to be following it the best I can now that, this is a little more clarification than I've had before, and I've called the League of Minnesota Cities on this numerous times, and they just always tell me that, like what you said, not just always, but what they tell me is that you have to just consider an abstention a no vote. That's what it is.
Yeah,
It's a
that's
no
the
vote.
general rule, and
Yep.
us
Unless
leagues
they
can always make it more complicated, so it is kind of dependent on the unique circumstances for any given motion, but generally, yes, an abstention that isn't required is going to be counted as a no.
Yep.
I was the chair of the Charter Commission for a number of years. As you know, we worked on a lot of these things, but my question, I always said I would ask if I ever had you in front of me talking about this, and so I guess there's opportunities now. When you talk about a quorum, it's very clear in the charter about council members and what constitutes a quorum. Question would be, if you have an issue where the mayor can vote, does the mayor count towards the quorum at that point? 'Cause that was a question we struggled with.
I'll give you my best lawyerly answer that it depends on the motion. No, but seriously, I would say your takeaway from this should be, there's 9 of you, including the mayor. A quorum, generally speaking, is considered a majority, so any 5 of you, including the mayor, could potentially become a quorum. I know what the charter says. I know the charter says the mayor doesn't count for purposes of a quorum, but the mayor does have responsibilities, and I think it's possible that notwithstanding the charter language, there could be situations where the mayor, if he is the 5th person, could tilt the balance in favor of there being a quorum.
Well, that was where we struggled, because there are some cases where the mayor can vote, and if
Right.
that was the issue you're talking about, then the mayor would count in a quorum and constitute a violation of open meeting law.
Potentially, yes. Any other
Not that you're
questions?
doing that, but that is an issue we had. We struggled with that one.
Well, thank you very much for your time, as always.
Thank you for the information.
I will
know-
say, I purposefully left the more detailed version of the presentation in your slides. If you have time and look through it, I think for the most part, it's self-explanatory, and I would certainly invite anyone that has questions about any of the specific slides that I didn't cover to follow up, either with me or with Ike.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Next, we have a presentation from Mr. Steve Brizendine on Robbins Island Regional Park entrance beautification.
Mayor,
Mr. Holland.
if I may, I would like to just make a couple comments, and we are running out of time already, and so I just want to make a clarification. The Robbins Island entrance beautification project before you is coming on behalf of the Willmar Rotary Club. And the Rotary Clubs, when they have projects, especially of this financial amount, they apply for grants within Rotary International. and then regionally, the other clubs can participate. So what we're asking for tonight, we have in your packet there a schematic drawing and some cost estimates. But what I would like to do simply tonight is just ask for a motion to approve the project itself and with Rotary International with the city of Willmar. And then we will come back with a more final drawing and draft of the sign and the layout, because this came before me just late last week, and we have not had time as a staff to go through the project with myself in particular, and also with our Parks Department to see, if this will meet what we're looking for in the park. So if you could put up a couple of signs. I mentioned in my report last week about some of the signs here in the town are obviously in disarray and disrepair. But these are some of the newer signs. If you go to the next one, the wastewater treatment facility and the airport are two of our newest signs. Go to the next one. So you can kind of see there is kind of a pattern there. You can call it Audrey's, she's shaking her head at me. It's not a branding. I know we had this conversation when I first got here in June. And so what I'm saying is that I'm looking at all the signs throughout the town, and I think maybe if we have time at the end of the meeting, I'll elaborate a little bit more. But we do need to improve our signs here throughout the town. There is no logo on these signs that I've just put up on the screen, and that's sort of where I'm trending right now. Is if we go forward with Rotary, we do something similar like this. You can call it generic if you want, but it would use the same color scheme, and then we can always add a logo. So I know the mayor, I think he called the logo a name one time, but what do you call the logo?
Flying W?
Yeah, the Flying W. So I thought it was the Flying Squigglies. I didn't want to say that.
I think
So
that's what
I
you
didn't
called
say
it.
that.
Right.
So that's basically, what we're talking about. I'll turn it over to Steve if you have any questions. It's a lot of money. We're very honored to have Rotary make this offer to enhance Robbins Island, and that goes along with the park project that was just completed this spring. So if you have any questions, or Steve, if I've missed something, if you'll go ahead.
Mayor Calvin, members of the
work
council,
session, so-
yeah, before you is a preliminary or draft design of entrance into Robbins Island. We have actually been working on this for a better part of a year. Goes back to when the Vietnam Wall was at the park a year ago, and some folks came in and talked about how can we beautify the entrance, and I think the mayor and I have had this discussion as well, probably months ago as well. But working with Stacy's Nursery and SRF and Uncommon USA, along with Quick Signs of Willmar, we've got some conceptuals of what we'd like to do to the entrance to the park. As you drive into Robbins Island to the right-hand side, there is some current plantings and signage to the right-hand side. I think it's got one of those old green sign timbers that we've been using for decades. And what we'd like to do is to tear out that area and replace it with the schematic that you're seeing here. As Ike said, the Rotary Club has dedicated their resources from this year's Rockin' Robbins programs to this project. As Ike said, we have written a grant to the district Rotary Association. We've got 4 communities partnering with us on this project. St. Cloud, Litchfield, Monticello, and Springfield have all committed resources to a matching Rotary grant. So as you can see, we've got near a $24,000 project. Uncommon USA and Quick Signs of Willmar have discounted their product 50% to be a partner in this. Stacy's Nursery has given us a good price for the install of much of this landscaping that would take place. We think it's a good project to consider, and we do have some refining to complete yet, as Ike said, but I think the diagram of the area itself, minus the signs, are what we're looking to do, and Sean's team of Public Works, along with Stacy's Nursery, would dismantle the current area and come in there and install the new plantings and landscaping, along with flagpoles, 50-footer and 2 35-footers that Uncommon has given us a great price on. The Rotary, in exchange for the resources to do that, would like to be able to put the Rotary wheel in this landscaped area as well, as a recognition for the things that the Rotary Club has done at that park and continue to pledge to do at that park in the future. That is one of the things that the Rotary Club has committed to, is the beautification of Robbins Island, and what projects coming forward would meet their needs from a financial perspective, and they would like to pour their Rockin' Robbins resources into making Robbins Island a better destination facility. So, as many of you know, they did dedicate $20,000 of their resources last year to the destination playground, and this project is where they'd like to put the 2017 resources. I'd stand for questions.
Councilmember Nelson.
Just a clarification, because I thought I heard we were simply approving the grant application and that the design would come back to us.
What we're asking for tonight is just the approval that we can work with the local Rotary. That's it. And the reason I'm doing this tonight is because there is a deadline with the Rotary Club. Otherwise, I would have waited until I had a complete project and given you options and the prices and everything. But I was asked to bring this to you tonight because they need that. So I'm just asking tonight for approval to work with Rotary International, then they can report back in their grant that the City Council has given approval.
Okay, just further clarification, because what I was hearing from Steve was that it was what it is. And I do believe we need some Willmar identity on it. And this was brought, I think, the same design like 3 months ago and pulled, and because we had a discussion about logos and we had a discussion about bringing it back, but nothing's changed. From very grateful for what Rotary is doing. I don't want to come off that I'm not, but I am concerned about what we're starting and what we'll do next, and that there should be some Willmar logo and a plan there, and I thought we had talked about getting community input into that logo.
Sean?
I think there's an exciting time in Willmar, and people are making investment into the city, and we need to take advantage of that and keep that momentum going. And if moving this forward, I would, definitely, we can make motions here, I would make it, but I would be totally supportive of moving this tonight, the concept of putting this sign in. What exactly would be on the actual sign itself, you can work that out, and then we can look at that for approval later. But the concept of putting this in the ground, I think we need to do that. I mean, this is a great time in Willmar, and people are willing and able to put their dollars forward on things, and we need to support that. So I think we should move this forward tonight to our meeting later.
Any objection to that? Okay, next item on the agenda, we have the Civic Center sound system. Now, I've got this as Steve, Brizendine, and Sean. We're running very short on time, so be brief, brother, be brief.
Mayor, members of the council, in front of you is a request for a sound system, a complete sound system overhaul at the Civic Center. And I will summarize. The current circumstance has 28 loudspeakers, several subwoofers. Equipment is 25 years old, a mixture of home theater speakers and very dated. What we're asking for is a digitized, Bluetooth-capable system, basically an updated system. We received 2 quotes, the lowest of which is $45,000 and change. And what we're asking for, the recommendation is to approve the funds from the 17 budget that we saved by not doing the Swanson Field project. There are alternatives, of course, as you see there. One alternative would be, there's a chance that the Warhawks organization have offered to fund some of those costs, that then we would pay them back out of the 2018 budget, which is in the CIP. Or I guess the other alternative, of course, would be to wait until after this season and live with this system one more year.
Is this time sensitive, Sean?
If we want to get it done before the season, yes.
Okay.
Just remind me, did we not talk about reallocation of those funds?
Yeah, there's about 120,000 left.
And so when we talked about putting, help me out, when we talk about putting playground equipment back in, we're talking about pulling this 45 out of the 120 that was left, that we had talked about that piece. Is that where we are here?
Well, I wish Steve B. was, Steve Okens was here, but there should be enough funds to do both of those projects, the neighborhood parks and this project. There should be enough for both of those. Do you remember what those numbers were, Steve? You had your finger up there.
Mayor, off the top of my head, I don't have the exact numbers that you're referring to. I was just going to add that in talking to Mr. Okens about this, if indeed the 2018 budget is going to include these dollars, there are ways to pay back, very similar to how you did the city auditorium refurbishing a few years ago, fronting dollars up front and then paying them back in other ways, I think was an option that wasn't included in here that we did not get all the information on from the finance director at that point. That was the addition that I had to what Sean talked about.
Because my recollection was we reallocated those dollars that were supposed to be for the Swanson Field concession stand, a few other things, and we as a council had set priority items of where those were to go. And we had a little overflow fund that we said that those dollars would go back to city playground equipment. If we do this, I know it takes from that, I don't know where those numbers will end up, but I mean, I would want to make sure that we're putting adequate dollars to start putting some of that equipment back, because we did say that that was our priority, but 45 is a piece of that. It would be a third of it if my calculations are correct.
Yeah, as I remember, and I don't have the document in front of me, as I remember, there's about 220,000 left. And what the council said is they didn't want to put all of that money towards playground equipment. And so we allocated about 100,000 of that, which then left 120,000. That's where my 120 is coming from.
So you're saying there's 220 or 120?
Well, there's 220, but we allocated the 100 for the neighborhood playgrounds, which left 120. That's my recollection.
Okay.
I see people digging through their files here trying to find the numbers.
We ask staff to look it up between.
Can we look it up in between? Because it's in the documents of our last meeting, or 2 meetings ago.
I have a different question.
Go ahead.
So when we did the new scoreboard out there, there were other community members that contributed to the dollars, I believe. Because I remember the question being, let's make sure we have to ask for help and to get something that they wanted, both to use for school and for others. So is this a system that meets everyone's needs, and have we asked for contributions from the people that use the facility regularly?
Councilmember Nelson, to answer your question, to the best of my ability, we did have partners in the scoreboard, with Burnix Pepsi being the largest partner of that. This sound system has been vetted by the Warhawks and the Hockey Association. We've talked to the school programs about this as well, and the capabilities that it would have to mesh the sound system with the projector screen that is out at that facility as well. And I think there's support. Nobody has spoken about financial support other than the Warhawks have said they would potentially front this money, as Sean said, with paybacks, and whether that would be us giving them cash or in lieu of their lease payments that they've got for the facility. So that's all we've talked about from a financial perspective. If we move forward with this sound system, there's some add-ons that the Warhawks would do to this sound system. I think that's in the neighborhood of $14,000 to $18,000 of additional amenities that they'd like to see in this system. But this system alone is an upgrade that we think works for all the users of the facility, and the Warhawks would add on to that to meet their needs, is what the latest conversation has been.
Is that something the Warhawks would leave for everyone to use then, or only for their games?
This is, all the conversations with the Warhawks about that facility is if these items are in that facility, that all users would have access to them.
What about the Blue Line Center? Is that, I mean, that's 10 times worse than the Civic Center.
Yeah, the Blue Line Center is a whole nother story. We do have prices that just came across the table today that Rob Baumgarn, the manager of the facility, is hopeful that the budget stays on target, as we would say it today. I can't see you, Ron, so I'm going to move this. That we think that there will be money in the small tools category of his budget to potentially deal with the Blue Line Center with our own budget, operation budget dollars, and he's gotten prices from Fat Freddy's to accommodate that work. And I know you've had conversations with some of those upgrades that he's had.
What happens if we cross the Ts and dot the Is and come back in 2 weeks when you have all of the information for both? I mean, can we wait that long?
I think we're fighting some timelines. The Warhawks have their season opener around the 14th or 15th of October. How much of this work can be done with ice? I think most of it can be done with ice on, but the timing of that's going to be difficult. Why this is being brought to you tonight is for your thoughts to it in hopes of having action 2 weeks from tonight is what, or last
Okay.
May.
Great.
That's a timeline that we could live with.
So, okay, so you're saying we don't have to do this tonight so we can get additional information?
Yes, that is correct. Obviously, with time sensitive, tonight would be awesome, but we do understand that we needed to bring this to you and give you the time to deal with it.
I'm an avid Warhawks fan, and it's very, very much needed. I don't know who's being introduced. I have to just look at their jerseys because you can't hear it through the PA system. And so, I mean, it's very much needed. I think it would add a special ambiance out there during those games. My only question would be just the funding of it. And if we could, if the numbers you quoted, Mr. Mayor, are correct, I would have no problem moving it forward. But those seem to be in question because if we do have those residual funds from the reallocation, I think that this would be a place to put it. I don't know if you think I know the answer to that.
Okay.
The only thing I would add to that is the Warhawks have agreed to front the money. So we can either pay for it this year or we can pay for it next year. The funds are there. So it's just, moving it forward with them, I think would be preferable. And then, we don't, I just, to me, waiting till the last week or 2 weeks before an event is not the right time. Now is the time to do it, because if you have mistakes or errors, then you have time to fix it. And then you don't have to answer to people, why doesn't the speakers work tonight? So we're about a month out. To me, I would like to get this moving one way or the other. And like I said, you're either for it or against it. The money will come out, and we'll find it either in this year's budget. If it's not there, then you approve it in the 2018 budget, the CIP. That's my recommendation.
I would have no problem moving it forward tonight, under those conditions.
I agree with what you're saying. I would encourage that we reach out to some of the organizations that use the facility, Cardinal Pride, the Willmar Hockey Association, anybody that's going to benefit from the use of this equipment. I think we should just reach out to them because they want to be a part of this. And I'm forward for moving it forward. I like Councilman Muskie indicated, I would like to have a better feel for the numbers, but I think it has to be done. And I like what City Administrator Holland is saying, that we should get it going and move on it. I agree with that. I think we should step it up.
I just need, if I may,
Go ahead.
just need to make a comment. I agree it's the 11th hour, but why are we just getting it tonight? If we've known about this for a year, why are we just getting it tonight? And if we're getting it tonight, why don't we have all the Ts crossed and the Is dotted? That's my concern, is everything seems to be the 11th hour, and when you ask a question, the answers aren't there.
Well, I haven't even been here, but just listening to the comments, I think the speaker system has been an issue for a long time, so that's not in question. I think this proposal from the Warhawks, I just became aware of it within the last week or so, so it's not been around for a year, as far as I know, about their proposal to pay for it and put the money up front, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, I kind of see it as there's a champion to do it. I mean, they have a clear vested interest in having it done, and if they're able to front the money to have it done, I think we should support that.
Okay, I'm seeing consensus to move that to the agenda item as well. Okay, next we have the Auditorium Environmental Services Proposal. Sean?
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I'll try to summarize this one as well. This is for the changing out the blocks at the gun range, as well as an annual deep cleaning. The quotes we've received so far are about $25,000 for each of those two items. The intent was that the blocks would last and be replaced every 3 years. These did not make it that long, so it's going to be an every other year item. So the intent was to have this $25,000 to $30,000 for the blocks in next year's budget, but in order to have a season at all this winter, they need to be replaced now.
Okay, council, the recommendation is that we have currently budgeted $14,000. We need an additional $10,780 for the cleaning services. And then on top of that, we need another $25,485 for the replacement of the ballistic blocks. And I add that up to be $50,265.
It must get used, it must be used quite a bit, I mean, for that to not last 3 years. And then I have a question of the police department's gun range. What are they doing out there, and what's it costing?
Police department range or the sheriff's department range, it's a shared facility between the sheriff's department and us. Out there is an annual cleaning that's done by a professional service. The blocks, because there is probably less shooting that's going on there, blocks have lasted maybe about 5 to 6 years. I know this year the police department itself split the cost of about $8,000 for professional cleaning for that.
For the year?
For the year.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Maybe we should take your blocks, and then you can take these.
For the right price, we'll sell them.
Councilman Rasmus?
Well, the way I see this from some of the figures that were in here, it's, the way we're going right now, it's going to be $13,000 a year just for the blocks. And then it's about $12,000 a year for the cleaning service, which gets us, and that's generous, I think, because that still doesn't include the environmental consultant that needs to be contracted to provide the lead clearance sampling. So we're at, and I believe this last year, we've already spent $30,000 cleaning it?
Last year, we spent over $30,000 cleaning it last year, I believe.
So we're at 25 to 30,000 just in maintenance here, and that's not including any staff time that's going in and cleaning. And we put, what, 750,000 to $1 million into that? And the issue, I wasn't on the council then, and I'm just like, for a small special interest group, that we spend $1 million for this facility, and we're looking at over 50,000 or 30,000 a year to maintain it. And we quabble over $6,000 for playground equipment and landscaping? This doesn't make sense to me. And we're in a position now where it can't be used because of the ricochets of the blocks being so full of lead. I don't understand how we put that money into it 3 years ago, and I don't understand how we're going to maintain it at 30 to 50,000 a year.
Well, it appears that somebody set up these systems with blocks. We didn't have blocks before. They had lead collectors. Shoot into them, fill the lead, take it out. Somebody set them up to make some money on this, it appears to me. They all do it in the name of safety, but it does bring people to Willmar, and it generates money where our parks don't. I mean,
Okay, we also.
I agree that we spent an awful lot of money on to do that. It also helped to refurbish the auditorium, and that HVAC system was not just for the gun range. You know, the filtering system was, but, you know, I forget when that was put in, years and years ago, but it's gotten a lot of use by a lot of people, and people need a safe place to shoot in the winter. It makes the winter go a lot quicker, and we do get people to Willmar from it. They travel here from 40, 50 miles to shoot down there. And I agree, it's a lot of money. Councilmember Osmus, it's a chunk of money, but it seems like somebody set this up because we had 50, 60 years of collecting lead and no blocks to shoot in. Anyway.
That doesn't mean it was safe, and that's the issue we got into. But I think another issue we have is how many other city properties, facilities do we have where private people use it to make a living, that make profit? So I think we have at least, 4 different firearms instructors that charge, $100 a head for their people to go through to get qualified to carry. So let's say they have 10 people in a class. They're making $1,000.
Yeah, but that's not for you to say. That's not, we don't get into what they charge. That's none of our business.
I'm not saying we are.
You know.
I'm not saying we have any say in what they charge. I'm just saying that they're using the city's facility, and we're charging them what for the rent?
Well, the Civic Center gets used also for that. I mean, people are making money out there, and we're losing money at Civic Center, we're losing money at the aquatic facility and the community center. I mean, some of this is quality of life, and we keep hearing that about the aquatic center, but fine, we got it given to us, but all of a sudden this year, what did we spend this past year? What are we going to spend on the new floor in there? It's a chunk of money. It isn't less than $10,000, it's $10,000 to $100,000. And so that argument, to me, isn't making a lot of sense. People can use it to make money. I mean, it's their privilege.
Let's stay to the issue and not go after each other. Sean?
Well, does it make sense to close it down? I see that's one of the alternatives here, and I'm going, really?
Councilman Maskey?
People in Willmar do all kinds of recreational activities, and this is a valid and wonderful recreational activity. Question, though, if we're going to say, well, this generates revenue, this happened before I was on the council, too, when the decision was, what kind of revenues are coming back because of the facility? Do we have numbers like that?
Steve, do you have those?
To date, in 2017, we have collected just under $3,600 from the daily usage when it's open in the wintertime. So from January 1st through, I think they closed down the end of March, just under $3,600. And the concealed carry classes and rentals of that facility, where are you? question. It's here.
While you're looking,
Marv can't handle it.
Can we, can,
Well, it would just seem to me, a follow, but it.
I think it's
it would
just
seem to
short
me
of
that-
10,000 total between the two of them.
It's just under 10.
Okay, because I don't know if that's something to look at as the costs are getting larger, whether or not, and why they're getting more expensive, I don't know. But the fact is they are. And if we have a $25,000 a year to put into the facility, I don't mind that. If there is some money that is, I mean, I don't know what the threshold should be, but if there's money that's going back to that facility, I feel much more comfortable with that. And so I think maybe we should probably have a longer conversation about this. I'm not in favor of closing it today.
keep in mind that they're preaching safety here. And a lot of people have weapons these days, and it's important to teach safety.
Councilmember Schwantes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Looking at the time, I'd like to recommend a couple things. And first would be to direct staff to determine what the true cost is of operating the gun range. And that would be those expenses that we see, but also staff time and electric, anything that you would do normally for Dorothy Aquatic Center or the Civic Center, any of our other enterprise departments. So do a true cost analysis on it. Then secondly, set up a fee structure that's going to be reflective of the fee structure that we see in our other enterprise departments. So if we're paying, 60% of those expenses are coming from user fees, then that's what we use, something very similar to that. And then third, we would approach the gun club and confirm that they are interested in using the facility with the new fee structure that we have. And then fourth, I would say, because we now know that this is an unsafe environment, imminent was the word that was used in the description. I think we have an obligation to close the facility until the facility has been brought up to code so that we know that it's a safe environment for people to be in. If someone is injured, we would have a serious liability before us. And I consider it the same situation that the city had when these other decisions were made, but if it's not safe, we should not have people in there.
One thing that I've learned is, as I talk to people through the community, they say they want the city to operate like a business. Well, if you're in a business and you were bringing in $10,000 worth of revenue and you were spending $50,000 to operate it, you wouldn't be in business very long. And I understand where the Dorothy Olson Aquatic Center, like you mentioned, Councilmember Christensen, and the Civic Center, they don't cover their costs either. But I mean, we're not even close here, folks. And we're not even in the same county, maybe not even the same state. I mean, the costs that we charge should be close to what the rest of our facilities are. I agree with Councilmember Schwantes on that. So let's bring this to the regular meeting. We have to take an action. I mean, if the consultant is telling it's in imminent danger, we certainly shouldn't stay operating until we get it solved. But, I'm not sure if what we're asking is to get this information to come back to another meeting, to then have that report with all of the facts.
Right.
I mean, I asked for some of this information on Thursday of last week. I thought we would have it today, but we didn't have it. Steve Okins was out. But I'd hoped we would have some of those numbers, so I think that's what we need to do. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, we are not getting to the work session agenda item again. Councilmember Meske.
I guess I'm going to request, I don't know, when we put this agenda together, the next agenda, I believe that item needs to be number 1 on the agenda, because putting it at the back, we never get to it. And that can't happen anymore. We need to have the discussion and get to it. So it would be my recommendation that, and I know that we probably don't set the agenda around this table, others do, but I would request that that be put up to the top of the agenda for next time, so we can talk about it.
Are you talking the work session?
Work session, right.
Yeah.
Correct.
So when we prepared the agenda, I will tell you, last Thursday, the agenda looked different than it did today. Not substantially, but different. And it was my understanding that the open meeting discussion was going to be much briefer than that. So, but we had a lot of questions, and so that's why it went longer. So it's good information. What we need to remember, folks, is that Ike has been with, Mr. Holland has been with us for a short amount of time. He's trying to clean up all of this stuff that we asked to have done that never got done. And so he's working his tail off to get this done. And he, trust me, on last Thursday when we had this conversation, and Judy can attest to it, I mean, there was lengthy discussion about, we think we should have about half hour, 45 minutes to talk about work session. Well, we never got to it. So, Mr. Holland, make sure we put that number one issue.
Number one.
Okay, thank you. We'll adjourn to the next meeting.